Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I speak with Edward Ashton. Edward Ashton is a science fiction writer and the author of numerous novels, including Mickey 7, which became the basis for the movie Mickey 17. His most recent novel is The Fourth Consort, which is a fascinating first contact story and touches upon so many different topics, from humanity's uniqueness to how to think about interstellar confederations. I loved it and wanted to discuss it more with Ed. Ed and I had a chance to talk about the origins of the Fourth Consort, the science fiction features he was playing with and subverting, and how science fiction shouldn't simplify alien species or human beings. We also spoke about the unique features of humanity, the power of storytelling and how it has allowed humanity to triumph on Earth, the qualities that allow for technological intelligence, and much more. We even talked about the dark forest theory, underestimating humans, interstellar federations, and the exploitation of other species, and other authors and writing that Ed would recommend. This conversation was a blast, and I had a great time speaking with Ed. Let's jump in. Ed, welcome to the Orthogonal Bet.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, this is super exciting. I recently finished reading the new novel, The Fourth Consort. It's fantastic, and I really want to. I had a lot of ideas and topics related to this. Maybe the best place to start, though, is to kind of just take a step back, and I would love to learn more about the story of how you came to write that novel, like the world building, the plot itself, like what if any, were kind of various reasons why you decided to write this book.
So with this book, I wanted to try to do something that I had not done before, but that I had wanted to play with for a while. And that was really built around the character of Dalton Greaves. This was a sort of character that I loved when I was a kid. And I had never tried to write myself, which I have sort of colloquially referred to as the hyper-competent but broken man. This is somebody, David Brin was big with characters of this sort. You see them in a lot of the science fiction in the 1970s and 1980s. Somebody who has an amazing background, they have all kinds of skills and talents, but something went wrong in their life that threw it completely off track. And for Dalton, that's the death of his father, which really throws him into a very dark place. That serves as sort of the inciting incident for the book and for getting him into the trouble that he winds up getting into. So I started with that. I often start with character.
Okay.
I feel like as a writer, character is much more important to me than science and setting. I feel if you get the character right, you can probably make an interesting story no matter where you drop them. And if you get the character wrong, it doesn't matter how great your tech wizardry is, it's going to be a boring story. And so that's where I started. I also had an image that had been stuck in my head for a while that I had played with. I'd played with them in a short story years ago in a much less satisfying way. And that was the picture of someone standing on the surface of a planet, looking up and seeing his ship explode above him. And that sort of image, I didn't know if this was Earth or some other planet. I didn't know what he was doing there. I didn't know what had happened to his ship, but I just had this idea in my head of a man standing on the surface of the planet looking up with his jaw hanging open, dumbfounded, as his ship just burst into a supernova above him. And so I started with the character and I started with that picture, and I thought, how can I build a story around this? And that's really what the genesis of the book was.
Oh, I love that. That's fascinating, right? Like that. Well, yeah, the image as like inciting incident, and also the character. It's also interesting you mentioned like this like hyper competent but flawed person. I feel like that, I don't know if that's like from when you were saying like the 70s or 80s, maybe like the silver age of science fiction. Like if you go back one generation earlier, there were a lot of characters in like the golden age where it was just the hyper competent man. Like there was no broken component to it.
Right.
And that definitely changes the kind of stories where it's the person kind of can do everything and they also are not broken. They're also probably a lot flatter as people.
To me, that's not an interesting character, though. It's like, I don't know if you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, but I always thought the folks who played the paladins were boring, right? Because
they can just do too much, yeah.
He's good and he's perfect at everything, and he always makes the right decision, and he always is working for the common good of everybody. I go back to Lord of the Rings, right? Aragorn is a paladin. Aragorn is perfect. He can do anything. He can defeat anyone.
He's also really boring.
Yes, and he's super, super boring.
Yes.
Boromir is a much more interesting character, right?
Yes.
Boromir, also, he's got his skills and talents. He's a great fighter. He's a great warrior. but like, he doesn't want to be. He's only there because his dad made him come.
Right.
Right. That's the only reason he's even on this quest. And to me, that's a much more interesting character, because when he does the right thing, it's because he's made a conscious choice to do it, not because he always does the right thing.
Well, it also feels like, right, it's much more, these people are much more deeply human, which, and humans, right, we have strengths and weaknesses and we can overcome them, but we're making choices. We're not just kind of this, right, this given as this thing, which also, I guess, is related to, I mean, for me, when I think about your novel, one of the other kind of things that it slots into, in addition to kind of like the image and the character, is just the class of story of like first contact, which also means that you're thinking about humanity in kind of in relationship to the other. And that's like, and first contact is a very, very large genre. I'm not even sure if we can kind of call it just some sort of category of stories. How did you decide to place your character Dalton in a first contact narrative? And like, and how much first contact storytelling had you kind of been exposed to beforehand as you kind of thought about this? Like, were there things that you had seen done well, done poorly? How did you think about that?
I made a very conscious decision to write this as a first contact story, because this is a type of story that I have been interested in for a long time. I think we as a species have a sort of an innate desire to have someone to talk to, someone different from us, someone who thinks in a different way. That's going back to sort of Dr. Dolittle, right? Why does he want to talk to animals? Because they might see the world in a different way than we do and give us some insight that we don't have. And if you look at first contact stories going back historically, again, sort of like you had talked about different waves, you can see different waves in older science fiction. Humanity is always right and is bringing the benefits of civilization to almost sort of like the colonial myth, where, you know, we're finding these benighted creatures out in space and bringing them the glories of human civilization and blah, 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 blah. And then there was a shift. And again, going to this sort of 70s and into the 80s, looking at people like Ursula K. Le Guin, where now humanity is actually a plague and we are spreading disaster wherever we go. And again, I find both of those narratives uninteresting. I wanted to present something that was a little more complex, where we're not the heroes or the villains. We're just sort of in the mix like everyone else and trying to do our best and trying to do the right thing, not really sure what that is, working with incomplete information. And I don't think I've read a ton of stories along those lines, and that's why I wanted to write one.
I love that. Yeah. And I'm trying to think of examples, from earlier generations. And like, I guess, so when you were saying about the kind of like negative aspects of humanity versus kind of like humanity is like the bringer of light to other alien species or whatever. And I feel like the ones that are maybe a little messier, was it like the mote in God's eye from like, is that the 70s? Maybe I can't remember.
Yeah, that's like Niven and Pornell.
Yeah, and that one, I'm not even sure how to categorize that one. That one's probably more just a commentary on like overpopulation and things that people were concerned about during that time period.
Yeah, I would put that one more in the category of humanity on being the unmitigated heroes.
Yeah,
right? Because
I would say so.
The aliens, they don't know how to control themselves.
Right, they're kind of a mess.
And they ruin everything. And we're sort of showing them, no, it doesn't have to be this way. You could do it better. Do it like us. And that's, like I said, not a story I wanted to write.
Well, and that also, I feel like in terms of the colonial aspect, I mean, that often implies that there is like one mode of being human that is the best, versus recognizing like when humanity is going to interact with another species or like alien civilization, we're not a monolithic thing. And this is always, and you see this a lot in science fiction in general, where it's like, oh, like, I don't know, like in the Star Wars world, like you go to like the ice planet and the desert planet, and like each one kind of has its own little biome, and like very, very simple, versus, I mean, you look at Earth, we are not a desert planet or ice planet. We're lots of different things. And the same thing is true at the geopolitical level and how we think and cultural level. And I feel like there's often this collapsing of humanity in distinction to, certainly to like other species. Like you have like, I don't know, in the Star Trek world of like, you have like the logical species of the Vulcans, and you have a trickster species of the Romulans, or the warrior species of Klingons. And like, obviously there's differences at the edges, but they're all very monolithic. And I feel like sometimes then they work backwards and say, oh, well, then humans are also a single thing, even though we've never been a single thing. And so did you consciously think about that as you're kind of trying to incorporate this more nuanced approach to first contact?
Yeah, I mean, the approach that you're describing really is just a way of simplifying the storytelling. It makes things easier as a writer and probably easier as a reader if you can say, "Oh, these are the warrior guys, and these are the smart guys, and these are," and we do. It's sort of natural as humans to want to categorize people
Right.
and things in that way because the world throws more data at us than our brain has any capacity to process. Simplifying and categorizing is one of the ways that our brain breaks things down so we can get through the day and continue to function. Yeah, again, I've tried, and I don't know if I succeeded or not, but I try to make things a little more complex than that. I try to not have real villains, not have real heroes. Everyone has complex motivations. Everyone thinks that they're right. No one out there, no one in certainly in my stories, and I don't think very many people in the real world wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to do evil today. I'm just going to wreck things up. I mean, I guess there's probably a few people like that who are severely mentally ill, but I don't think there's many people like that. I think most people, even people that we see as monsters, in their own minds are doing the right thing for just very, very bad reasons. And you have to give them their due in that fact. And I try to make sure that even my antagonists have their own sort of internal moral compass where you can see that, oh yeah, he's bad, he's wrong, but he thinks he's doing the right thing.
That's interesting. Well, and it's also, I feel like, heightened by the fact that in the novel, humans, they're not really in control. They're sort of, I don't know if client species is the right term, but like they kind of work for this other species that is kind of in charge of some sort of, I don't know, multi-species federation. And it seems as if humans don't really have the full picture of like what's going on, which is kind of interesting. Like you're kind of, they're operating under incomplete information, but still trying to do the right thing when it comes to first contact or engaging with other alien species.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. That is exactly the sort of setup that I wanted to put them in because, again, if you know everything, if you've got a full picture, your decision tree becomes simpler. And I didn't want Dalton's decision tree to be simple. I wanted him to have to make hard choices with incomplete information. And one of the ways of doing that is by not giving him really the full understanding of what's going on out there in the universe. He only knows what he's been told. And I think that's basically the paradigm that most of us live with, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of the human condition in many ways.
Yeah, and right. And I feel like you don't even need to go kind of like full Lovecraft of like, oh, humans kind of only understand like the thinnest veneer of reality, and the rest of it is just kind of this like horrors and things far beyond human understanding. It's just like, yeah, we are operating in a very complex world, and we don't fully understand it, and that's fine, and that kind of just sort of how it is.
Yeah, it's just some amounts of information are being deliberately withheld from us in order to manipulate our behavior. And again, that is basically the life that we live. I think that's true for you and me and everybody else in this world. Right?
Is there a way you think of engaging with the world with hope or optimism, even in the face of that of that perspective?
I feel that this book is a hopeful book. I feel like I'm a very optimistic person. Certainly relative to a lot of my friends, I'm a very optimistic person. I always have the bright side of arguments, even in very dark circumstances. And I think even working in that limited information environment, if you do have a moral compass that is somewhat accurate, you can do your best to divine out what is the right thing to do and to suss out how you ought to be behaving given the information that you have in front of you. And that's something, again, that's how I try to live my life. I would hope that most people would try to live their lives that way. And that's how I try to have my characters behave. They don't necessarily, as you say, have the full picture, but with the information they have, they try to do the right thing. And sometimes they succeed and sometimes they fail, but they always try.
I like that. Yeah, I also happen to be fairly optimistic by nature. And right, like just because we can't understand everything doesn't therefore mean that we kind of have to throw our hands up in despair. Like there are still ways of muddling through. And I also mentioned earlier about this, like the multi-species kind of nature of this federation or confederation that humans are part of. In terms of like the world building here, like this felt very different than like the United Federation of Planets of Star Trek. Like it had a very different kind of feel. Like how did you think about the world building of these multi-species federations?
I thought about it very much based on a sort of a historical model of the sort of colonialist era several hundred years ago, where you had competing factions, each of whom were sort of traveling around things and finding new places, new people, and trying to convince them to join up with us, right? You need to, don't talk to the Dutch. Those guys suck. but we British, we're going to give you the right things and we're going to take you down the right path. And by the way, the Germans are going to be here in like 6 weeks, and you really want to just like start shooting spears at them as soon as they show up, because they're really bad guys. And most of those people did not actually have the welfare of the people they were contacting in mind. In fact, they almost certainly didn't. They were exploitative, many of them evil. You could probably sort of say that, but my guess is that many of the people who were actually involved in those expeditions honestly thought they were doing, as I said, even though they were working under wrong assumptions, they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were doing good in the world, and that's the sort of universe I wanted to build. Both the assembly and unity in these sort of confederations that I put together, in large part, are probably exploitative. Maybe unity more so than the assembly are exploitative of the creatures that they're finding. But the individuals who are doing this work, many of them sincerely believe that they're, Breaker clearly sincerely believes that he's doing good. He thinks he's doing good in the universe and he's doing the right thing. And maybe he is and maybe he isn't, but he's trying. He's doing his best. And I would say I would put Dalton in that same category. Okay.
Yeah. And then actually one of the things that's really only tangentially touched upon in the novel, and I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on how much you thought about this, is like, and you mentioned kind of the exploitative component. It's hard to tell how much exploitation there actually is or is not, because humans joining the, unity, it seems that they were promised a whole bunch of stuff, they didn't really get it, but it's not entirely clear if they were being treated poorly. I'm just trying to get a sense of what do you think the motivations of the heads of these kind of respective federations? Is it going back to kind of what we were talking about earlier of the drive towards first contact is just this drive to engage with the other who is different and learn about someone who thinks differently and kind of be able to actually preserve that? Because I feel like there's hints of that of really the goal of first contact is just kind of preserve distinctive cultures and civilizations, versus maybe there is something nefarious going on and we kind of get a sense of it, but we don't really. Did you do any kind of more world building on your own, kind of under the hood of that kind of drove that, or even for yourself, you kind of just left it a little vague and mysterious?
No,
and
I did. I thought very carefully about what these confederations would actually be taking from their sort of client species, from the people that they had contacted. And again, if you go back to colonial era on Earth, a lot of what it was resource extraction. The Spaniards and the Portuguese show up in South America, and now you have shiploads of silver going back to Europe and completely destroying the market for silver in Europe because there's so much abundance of it. That doesn't really work when you're talking about interplanetary, interstellar travel, picking up, despite what we've seen in some science fiction, they sucking up all the water out of the ocean or whatever. There's a lot easier ways to get water than to carry it across, 40 light years of distance. It just doesn't make any sense to do that sort of resource extraction. So what could you extract? And the way that I saw it was extracting, number one, labor. They're using humans and other creatures that they've encountered to actually do the dangerous work that needs to be done. They're not going down to planets and sort of encountering new creatures and whatever. They're making their underlings do that kind of work. And then also knowledge and culture. I mentioned there's a little story in there about someone helping them sift through archives of human recordings and the contents of every library on Earth, looking for some piece of knowledge that might be valuable, some piece of technology, some scientific discovery that they hadn't come across yet. And my thought was that these two sort of rival species at the top of things have gotten to the top by picking and choosing the scientific insights and technological insights of every species they come across. So they didn't start out as such technologically superior creatures, but by picking a piece and never giving back, taking from each species, but never returning, they ensure that they keep getting more and more advanced, more and more wealthy, while the people that they're working with sort of stay on the bottom. And that's, whether that's a model of how things work here on Earth is left as an exercise for the reader.
Yeah. That kind of strip mining for knowledge is a really interesting kind of take. You mentioned also kind of the labor aspect of humans are being used to kind of do the dirty work. One of the aspects of the book is humans, they're constantly being underestimated, but they're actually really good at the labor that they're being chosen to do in terms of these first contact scenarios and things like that. How did you think about, because on the one hand, going back to what we were saying earlier, humans are all very, very different in many different ways. We have many different ways of thinking about the world. We're also not particularly specialized creatures, certainly within the biosphere of Earth, but we do have certain features. Like, how did you kind of think about, and maybe we can discuss it more or less with spoilers or not, however you think makes the most sense. How did you think about the uniqueness? I'm not sure if it's like uniqueness or not, because I hesitate to use that in terms of like thinking about humanity, but like, what are the features that you wanted to kind of highlight around humanity? Because like a lot of stories will talk about, oh, like humans are particularly adaptable relative to other alien species, which of course we've never seen before, and like that. Yeah, how did you think about that in terms of like the quintessential features or the useful features of humans?
The way that I looked at it, and this is something I wanted to sort of illustrate in the book, and I played around with this idea because I think it's a fun one, is that one of our real superpowers as a species is that everybody underestimates us. We've been being underestimated for 50,000 years. If you look at the distribution of large fauna on this planet, the only place where there's actually megafauna still around is basically Africa. And that's because that's where we evolved. And so those animals, they got 2 million years to sort of look at us and figure out, as we slowly improved our lethalness, and say, you know what, maybe we should stay away from those guys.
To become increasingly
maybe we gotta
wary.
give them some space. As soon as we moved out of Africa, you can follow waves of extinction.
Yeah.
As soon as we show up anywhere, anytime humans show up in a place, the megafauna is gone within 1,000 years. Unfortunately, that's just been the pattern around the world. And I think the reason for that, it's not that we are inherently sort of more dangerous than a tiger or a lion. I don't think that we are. But I think a lot of these animals just sort of looked at us and dismissed us. Look at that. It's a monkey. It's not a threat.
Right.
We've seen monkeys before. They're not going to hurt us. And by the time that they figure out that they've made a mistake about that, it's too late. And so that's really what I wanted to play with. And you see that sort of play out with both the Minarchs and with Breaker, as sort of underestimating how dangerous we can be until it's really too late.
It also, right. It's like not only they're underestimating, like humans are constantly being called prey species, and like even though I mean we are predators, even though we don't fit the profile of predators, and and that's like a really interesting kind of thing, right? Because we do look kind of weak and not particularly scary. The other interesting thing is I think there's one theory around this idea of neoteny, where like certain species kind of retain the features of like the young version of the species, and so like not only do we look like monkeys, the adult versions of humans look kind of like baby chimpanzees.
Yeah,
so like
baby monkeys.
Like we look particularly weak and useless and non-threatening, and then we subvert those expectations.
Well, the fact is, as an individual, we don't just look non-threatening. We really are non-threatening. You drop a naked human in the middle of the jungle. I don't know if you ever watched Naked and Afraid, but like we don't do well. Even well-trained humans who are like, I'm a survivalist. You barely manage to catch like 2 worms, and you are starving to death in 20 days. I mean, we don't do well on our own, and we don't do well without tools. We're not built for that, and that's very different. You talk about us being a predator. You drop a tiger in the middle of the jungle, he does just fine.
We're very communal predators, right?
Yes.
We don't necessarily do well on our own.
Absolutely.
And the interesting thing, and you also, so like you mentioned the Minarchs, and kind of in my head, and I'm not sure this entirely fits the description you had, but like they're kind of like these like gigantic, horrifying, like scorpion kind of lobster creatures, plus maybe with a hint of spider in there. I'm not sure if that's quite the way you imagine them. They are very, very scary and threatening creatures. They're also very threatening on their own, but they also have a very clear social structure. And like, and so on the one hand, and humans are only powerful because of our social structure. What do you think the specific features of like human social structure in terms of how we evolved makes us powerful or adaptable versus kind of other sort of social structures from other kinds of species?
This may be a little self-serving, but I firmly believe that it's our ability to tell stories. That's what separates us. And a lot, because and I don't mean just like to amuse one another around the campfire, but the things that allow us to cooperate in the thousands and millions are stories, right? Money is a story that we tell. Money means nothing, right? What is $1 at the end of the day? $1 is an absolute figment of all of our imagination, but it allows us to work together, to have complete strangers who know nothing of one another and owe nothing to one another, cooperate together to do things that no group, no family group even could conceivably do. And I think that's something that is very unique about us, and that no other species, certainly on Earth, has ever been able to replicate. And that's a big part of why we are where we are.
And that also, I think, speaks to the fact that, right, like the storytelling aspect of like being able to kind of create these sort of coordinating mechanisms means that even if other species have very clear social structures, those structures, in contrast to storytelling social structures, are fixed. It's like, okay, these are the ones I buy into, whether it's tribe or some sort of associated kin or whatever, versus saying, no, if I can tell a story that organizes us in a different way or on a larger scale, that completely changes the ability of us to cooperate and coordinate and do lots of different kinds of things.
If all of the elephants in Africa could get together and organize themselves into an army, we would be in very deep trouble. I mean, the Australian army was almost defeated by a force of emus once. So, stretch that out to elephants, I think we'd be in big trouble. So yeah, I think the fact that no other species has come up with the ability to coordinate on that kind of scale is one of the things that has put us, as I said, sort of where we are in the world.
And I can't remember, did you touch on that difference in terms of like the minarchs and their ability to have like kind of these organizing stories? I mean, you touch upon kind of like the geopolitics of the entire planet. I can't remember how explicitly you explored some of the storytelling or the lack of storytelling in terms of that kind of thing.
I didn't go into great depth on that, but the minarchs are clearly more of a clan-based social structure, which can be very effective, but is again, it's more limited because your ability to reach is limited basically by your bloodline and your alliances that you can form. So you can form relatively large structures, but not the sort of numbers that humans are able to achieve. I think I said the biggest city on the entire planet was maybe 20,000.
Right. Okay. So it's inherently limited, right? Because of it's a much more fixed social structure. I guess we don't get as much about the social nature of the stickmen, or I don't know if they do they have a name for their own species, or is that just kind of what humans call them? But
did you kind of just what humans call them?
Did you have a sense of like what their social structure was in your thinking?
I saw them as much more an individualistic kind of species. They do operate in clan groups, but in much more limited, more like tribal, how we were when we were in tribal stage, operating in sort of small family groups. And they were still, as I describe it in the book, they were still at a pretty primitive technological level when they were discovered by the assembly and sort of uplifted, brought up to a technological sort of level.
One other thing, and obviously, right, the aliens in the book, they're cobbled together from different things in terms of like the biodiversity on Earth. When people tell stories either of first contact or just kind of extraterrestrial intelligence in general, there's often there's a number of tensions of like, okay, how foreign do we make these kinds of things? Do we map them onto other kinds of things that we're more familiar with? Like, how do you think about sort of that like the dimensional space of extraterrestrial intelligence? Like, is it going to be unbelievably weird, and so like weird beyond what humans can understand? Is it going to be the kind of thing of like we've explored a lot of really interesting pathways on Earth, and so presumably a decent fraction of that is also going to be mimicked in outer space? How do you think about what that high dimensional space looks like, and like whether or not we've actually explored a decent fraction of it?
Well, I mean, there's two questions. There's how do I think things would actually work in the real world if we encountered an
versus
alien
like
species,
storytelling.
What is useful for me to tell a story that would be engaging to an audience here on Earth? And again, I look to other writers. We all stand on each other's shoulders, right? And on one extreme, you see alien species that are clearly just humans in rubber suits, right? And to me, that like I feel like Larry Niven. Like, I love some of his work, but a lot of his aliens are basically just humans in rubber suits. They've got the exact same motivations as we do. They've got the same social structures as we do. They kind of talk the same way that we do. To me, I didn't want to go that route. I try to avoid that. But at the same time, if you look at John Varley, and look at the Ophiuchi Hotline, he has an alien species that is so different from us that we can't even comprehend one another as actual life forms. Like, they see us as basically in the exact same category as ants and bees in terms of intelligence. We are an engineering species, and we can't even comprehend them as a life form. And again, while very interesting in that book, and I love that book, to me, that's not you can't make an interesting character out of that. So I wanted to find a sweet spot somewhere in between there where you had something that was comprehensible to us, something we could recognize as a sort of a fellow life form, but at the same time, something that was different enough that we can perceive it as again, being a different viewpoint on the universe. Someone who would see the world in a very different way. And that leads to some really interesting misunderstandings, which are fun for me to explore and also, can be very helpful in driving your plot.
And maybe I'm oversimplifying, but at least within Larry Niven, I feel like the one species that maybe isn't that kind of sweet spot is like the Pearson's puppeteers. That like they're kind of like, they're weird enough that there's some interesting, but yeah, maybe they're kind of just a caricature of like a certain subset of humanity. But you're right.
Yeah, they're just cowards, right? They're just hyper cowards.
Yeah, and like and the Kzinti are just kind of like very fearsome cats or whatever. But what? Yeah, I mean, so separate from the sweet spot for storytelling, what are your? I mean, do you have any thoughts on, like, well, first of all, even like the likelihood of extraterrestrial intelligence and like what it actually. Yeah, like what is that space out there if we actually truly encountered it? Would it be so weird that we wouldn't even know? Or is it the kind of thing where, I mean, presumably it would not be humans in rubber suits. That feels a little unlikely. But what are your thoughts on that reality?
Well, I mean, I would draw a distinction between intelligence and technological intelligence. Intelligence, I think we have some very intelligent species here on Earth that we don't maybe think of in that way. Elephants, very intelligent. Dolphins, whales, very intelligent. Octopus, very, very intelligent creatures, right. Very different sort of intelligence than we have, but clearly very, very bright. Corvids, very intelligent animals. But none of those are ever going to develop technology because there are other things that are necessary in order to develop technology. And from my perspective, the two things that are necessary are that you need an ability to manipulate hard matter, right? You need hands or fingers or something like this. And you need to be really crappy at being an animal. That, to me, is important because what drove us to develop spears and spear throwers and all this other nonsense was that we couldn't survive as animals, right? I mean, if you look at an elephant, elephants can manipulate things pretty well. The extension at the end of their trunk, they can hold a paintbrush, they can do all kinds of things. They've never tried to use it to build a car or a rifle because they don't need to. They can dominate their environment very easily with just the tools that they've been given, and why would they bother?
Or if you see certain species that have been around for like millions or tens of millions of years, like I don't know, like the coelacanth or the cockroach or things like they're really good at what they do. Like, yeah, they have their space in the biosphere, and there is no need to mess with it by evolution.
No need to change. Yeah, no need to change. So I think the reason that we have done the things that we've done is because we were actually pretty bad at being regular animals. I mean, we were clearly on the verge of extinction. I mean, I think a lot of genetic research has indicated that there were maybe only about 8,000 or 10,000 humans left on the planet 50,000 years ago, right before we sort of burst out. And that's sort of like cheetah levels of being an endangered species right now, which is pretty bad.
That's really interesting.
It would have taken one bad disease and humans would have been wiped off the face of the planet. And I think that sort of being ill-fitted to survive as we were is what drove us to develop all the sort of things that we've developed over the last 50,000 years.
Yeah. So then, okay. So yeah, in terms of like the technological intelligence, then like, do you really think it would be, I mean, if we found other technologically advanced intelligence, it would just be a whole suite of ill-fitted species to whatever their environment is that have kind of overcome those things using technology? Like, would that be something that would cause a certain amount of like convergent evolution in terms of like thinking or adaptation? Or I don't know how much you've thought about that kind of thing.
I think that the table of technologically developed species, if we find them out, is going to be very similar to the sort of the nerd table in the cafeteria in high school. It's going to be all the species that didn't fit in with the jocks and the cool kids. That's who's going to wind up in that space. As far as physical evolution, again, I think it would almost have to be a land-dwelling creature. It would have to be something that has some sort of tools for manipulating hard matter, whether that's dexterous tentacles or fingers or something like that. And probably something that's not too big and not too small, because if you're too small, you're not going to be able to meaningfully manipulate anything to a useful extent. And if you're too big, why would you need to? Because you're going to be able to, again, sort of dominate your environment without needing to do anything like that. So I think that does drive towards something roughly our size, give or take, 50% margin either direction, maybe. And, not necessarily with like 2 arms and 2 legs, but with things that form and that serve the purposes that our hands serve and that our legs serve and so forth. So I think you're not going to get super, super crazy far off from where we are right now and have something that, that's building airplanes and things like that.
I don't know if, do you follow any of the like research around like technosignatures, like trying to actually detect these kinds of things? Like, what is your take on kind of the best approaches for that? Like the likelihood of actually finding these kinds of things? How do you think about that space of technosignatures?
I'm actually a big believer in the dark forest hypothesis. I think we're probably not going to see a lot out there, because I think anybody who thinks about this sort of stuff very carefully is going to pretty quickly shut down any emissions that they're producing, because they don't want to be found. And the reason behind that is pretty simple. If you're able to accelerate an object, a macro object, to something approaching the speed of light, you've now created a weapon which is absolutely undefendable. If you can accelerate something to 99% of the speed of light, something that's, 50, 60 kilograms now carries enough energy to crack open the shell of a planet. The light announcing its arrival gets there a microsecond before the object itself does. There's no one even know it's coming, let alone to defend against it. So therefore, from a rational standpoint, if you know that such a thing is possible and you discover on some other nearby star another technological species, you have an obligation to destroy that technological species before they destroy you, because there's the only way to defend yourself, the only way to protect your own species is to destroy them first. And so the only way to survive in a universe like that is to either be the first and to be the one who does all the genocides, or to keep quiet. And I would hope that keeping quiet would be the way to go in that fight. I hope we don't become like either the victims or perpetrators of genocide. I hope that we learn to keep our mouths shut and keep our heads down and, maybe avoid detection. And I hope that there's other species, if there are other species out there, they're doing the same.
What do you think we've certainly sent communications out into space inadvertently and sometimes on purpose. How quiet do you think we are? Are we quiet enough? Or do we need to be quieter as a species, according to this field?
We've actually gotten a lot quieter over the last 30 or 40 years.
I guess we use cable.
There are no 50,000 watt radio stations anymore, right? That's a thing of the past. That was only about 15 or 20 years that we were doing that. Most of communications is it's on fiber optic cable now, which doesn't transmit. So there's certainly a shell of E&M radiation sort of propagating out from Earth right now at the speed of light. It's probably said 60 or 70 years out right now. I doubt that it's, beyond the very nearest stars. I doubt that the intensity of that is great enough to be actually detectable and separatable from the background noise, because obviously the intensity of electromagnetic radiation falls off with the cube of distance, which means, as you get out a couple of light years, your signal is very, very low. So I think we're probably in good shape, but
okay.
Like I said, make a point, like this idea of like, we should beam signals to the nearest stars to see if they can. No, that's a terrible idea. Please don't do that. Please go read The Three Body Problem and then come back and tell me you're not going to do that.
Do you think we were talking before about kind of various aspects of your optimism. Do you think there's a path out of this dark forest trap? Is it the sort of large federation kind of approaches? Are there any pathways out of basically just having to stay quiet?
Well, pathway one is to determine that it's actually not physically possible to accelerate an object to close to the speed of light. Right now, we think with antimatter rockets, which is the best technology that we've been able to come up with yet, if we could produce antimatter in large quantities, which we don't know how to do right now, we think we might be able to get up to about 0.3 C. That's not enough to be this sort of absolute doomsday weapon. So it's possible that it's simply physically not possible to accelerate objects like that. In that case, we're kind of in the clear. on that front. That means that we really do have this sort of cosmic quarantine enforced. It becomes completely impractical to ever reach anything certainly further than maybe like Proxima Centauri or something like that in any reasonable amount of time. So that's one option. The other option is if there's already someone out there, or if we can become the someone who's out there that actually is sort of decent and benevolent and can keep a lid on this kind of stuff. There's a novel called The Forge of God. I don't know if you've ever read that one, where basically he talks about this. It's Greg Bear. He talks about this kind of stuff, and in his formulation, there is this sort of government out there, a confederation of species, that whenever someone tries to do one of these genocide things, comes down on them and destroys them, basically. And so they enforce a peace by severely punishing anyone who attempts to do one of these sort of dark forest genocide things. I don't know if that might be too much to hope. That seems like a little bit of a stretch, but that's one hopeful take.
So we need to some sort of like interstellar cop superpower or something like that. But
yeah,
that might be a very path dependent outcome to kind of avoid this kind of thing. Oh, this is super interesting. I guess maybe like a last question. I mean, we've kind of talked a little bit about the kinds of stories that you've looked to and the ones that really haven't felt quite as rich or nuanced, especially when it comes to like First Contact. I mean, are there any writers or stories in particular that you would point to that you feel like, whether or not they've done it entirely right, they at least are kind of pointing to interesting aspects of the complexity of extraterrestrial intelligence when it comes to technology, how to think about First Contact, how to think about all these different issues? Like, what would be maybe like a small canon of books that you would kind of recommend as like other, like further recommended reading related to these kinds of things?
Well, I think among sort of currently active authors, the best person I could recommend in terms of thinking about how other species would think, how other species would see the world, sort of getting inside their heads, is Adrian Tchaikovsky. Absolutely brilliant writer, incredibly prolific writer. If you decide you like him, good for you, because you've got stuff to read for the rest of your natural life, because he produces a new book about every 6 weeks.
Yeah,
they're all fantastic.
Yeah, we actually had him on the podcast as well, and and especially when it comes to especially when it comes to kind of like this like Darwinian science fiction, right? Like he thinks very broadly about these kinds of things as well.
Yes, he's an absolutely brilliant person and a brilliant writer, and I can't recommend his work highly enough. I really liked David Brin's Uplift series, going back a little bit, going back to the 80s. He gets a little sillier with some of his creatures. Obviously, he plays, I was talking about sort of convergent evolution and how we would expect an intelligent species. He kind of throws that out the window. He's like, yeah, sure, a giant pile of wax rings, that could do it. That could be a technological species. Why not? But it makes for really interesting writing, and it does. Yeah. He does think about like, how would a giant pile of wax rings think differently than we do? Like probably very differently, honestly.
One would hope, yeah.
So that's those are really fun books, and I highly recommend those as well. Going back to really deep cuts, Clifford D. Simak was one of my sort of formative influences when I was very small. And he's, if you go to books like Shakespeare's Planet, for instance, he thinks a little bit about how alien species would think differently than us, who have come up with sort of different cultural norms and different biological imperatives.
Love that. Well, no, that is a really good selection of recommendations. I really appreciate that. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat. And now I have a lot of things to go read and think about further. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I think this was a fun chat.